89 years ago, in the depths of the Great Depression, the faint rumblings to come on the European continent were yet to be openly heard. And on this day, make sure this works, 89 years ago, a former World War I Austrian corporal had just taken power on this day in an economically bankrupt Germany, leading a party openly characterized by extreme nationalism and terrible anti-Semitism. Hitler was legally appointed chancellor on January 30th, 1933. After a few months of cunning terrorism, he cruelly manipulated his position into that of an all-powerful dictator. Millions of Jews in Europe personally and barbarically suffered from that man, as he was called by many people. Millions globally observed last Thursday as the International Holocaust Remembrance Day. But also, back in 1933, across the 21-mile-plus British Channel, Winston Churchill, although he retained his seat in Parliament, had been ignobly turned out of power for the first time. Many believed that his political career was finished. He was, they believed, soon to fade away. Churchill was not halfway through what historians today describe as his wilderness years. Remarkably, before Hitler even was named chancellor, Churchill was already warning of the dire consequences if that man actually rearmed Germany. But Winston was ignored, openly ridiculed, and this went on for years. In 1933, near the bottom of his political influence, he delivered a remarkable speech that went against the grain of the day. Here's an excerpt. Now remember, this is during the Great Depression, and Churchill is out of power. He said, "It may well be that the most glorious chapters of our history are yet to be written. Indeed, the very problems and dangers that encompass our country ought to make English men and women of this generation glad to be here at such a time. We ought to rejoice at the responsibilities with which destiny has honored us, and be proud that we are guardians of our country in an age where her life is at stake." Churchill, in his career, had made many catastrophic errors, but he had learned from them. Reading this speech struck me again how Churchill's singleness of purpose and calmness under pressure, molded and purified by fire, made him the right man for the times. And since we're here in a sermonette, not a history lesson, there are biblical principles reflected here. These principles can focus and energize us personally, even when we see problems and dangers that affect us and the place where we live, our lifestyle, and our day-to-day actions. The title for this sermonette is All the More. I'll get to the right slide here momentarily. I miss my little monitor here. Comes from Hebrews 10:25. To set the backdrop for the next few minutes, let's read this starting in verse 24. Hebrews 10, verses 24 and 25, and we'll put that up here so you can obviously see it. "Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works," the writer of Hebrews says, "not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near." As we explore this topic, let's keep this one statement of Churchill's, made more than a full decade before Britain would emerge victorious from a black war. Let it ring in your ears. It may well be that the most glorious chapters in our history are yet to be written. In this season of historical remembrance, the day that Hitler came to power 89 years ago, and the remembrance of the Holocaust and all that, let's look at two other short examples of Churchill's unmatched capacity to inspire and encourage. 7 years after that first speech, Hitler conducted lightning war, blitzkrieg, through France and Belgium. Disgraced, weary, and suffering from a soon-to-be diagnosed case of cancer, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain resigned. The king then summoned Churchill to Buckingham Palace and reluctantly asked him to form a new government, a national unity government. The process under which this takes place is anything but unified. The king and many of the key parliamentarians wanted a gentleman by the name of Lord Halifax. Discord and backbiting took place as Hitler advanced nearly effortlessly through the Western European continent. German tanks and troops just rolled over the French. Many believed that an invasion of England would soon take place in short order. For several days, Halifax pushes the fragile Churchill national government to negotiate for peace with Hitler through Mussolini. Many are for it, but Churchill refuses. During this time, the Foreign Office prepared plans for a possible emergency evacuation of the king and the royal family. They will go to Canada to rule the Commonwealth. In the event, Hitler continues his French and Belgian invasion across the 21-mile channel. Ambassador Joseph Kennedy, now openly pro-Hitler, gets wind of it and lets President Roosevelt know. And stunningly and astonishing, in response, President Roosevelt cables Churchill and point-blank tells him that don't bring the royal family to Canada because we don't want any more royals or kings governing from the North American continent. He expects Churchill to tell the king what the king can do with his dominion. So Churchill never answers the cable. He actually asked for, when he received it, he asked for another whiskey and soda and went to bed. But the point is that Churchill knew that he was totally alone. He was not going to get any help from America. He was not going to get any help from anybody. He had to face all this as France was falling to pieces. Now, with 300,000 British soldiers trapped on French soil, Churchill is faced with defeat. But he doesn't care, and he doesn't accept it. Instead, he has 3 copies of a famous quote from Queen Victoria made and posted conspicuously. This was a quote from a very dark period of a prior war, which Queen Victoria ultimately won against all odds. You can obviously read it. For those of you at home who don't see it, it says, "We are not interested in the possibilities of defeat. They do not exist." Finally, risking all in this fragile government, Churchill settled on his decision. He calls his entire cabinet together, and he delivers uncharacteristically unprepared and unrehearsed remarks. He says to these people, as the British army is trapped and the French army is failing 21 miles away, he says, "I have thought carefully in these last days whether it was part of my duty to consider entering into negotiations with that man," as he called him, Hitler, "but it was idle to think that if we tried to make peace now, we would get better terms." What was he really talking about? Churchill went on to illustrate how a negotiated peace with Hitler would give the Third Reich complete control of the world-powerful British fleet and all the British naval bases, effectively and ultimately sealing the fate of the United States and the rest of the world. And for those of you who have read the second half of Mein Kampf, that came out a few years ago, it openly talks about the conquest of the United States. It was never published in Germany during the war, but now it is. And Hitler had plans openly, after he conquered Russia, to turn his sights on the United States. Concluding, Churchill thundered on his own, "I am convinced that every one of you would rise up and tear me from my place if I were for one moment to contemplate parley, or surrender. If this Long Island story of ours is to end at last, let it end only when each of us lies choking in his own blood upon the ground." Churchill had seen plenty of that state of war in his life, and so had the people around him. So what did these people do, these people who had been calling for peace, telling us, let's go talk to Mussolini? They rose in unison, cheering, stomping their feet, shaking his hand, and clapping him on the back. He had one opponent in his whole life that was always against him. And this guy said he was a socialist. Churchill was quite magnificent. the man and only man we have for this hour. Well, we all know what happened. A few days later, Operation Dynamo succeeds. Against all odds, and while under essentially a full attack from the air, more than 338,000 British and French soldiers were miraculously rescued. Churchill would fly over that decades later and openly ask, how did they escape? He later appears in Parliament, gently warning the British people that wars are not won by masterly evacuations. But he goes on to declare this: Dunkirk was a miracle of deliverance, achieved by valor, by perseverance, by perfect discipline, by faultless service, by resource, by skill, by unconquerable fidelity, manifest to us all. And then he captured everyone. This is the short version. He said, we shall go on to the end. Remember, the United States is not in this. They're not saying anything nice. They're not giving him any indication. None of the people are doing anything. Britain stands alone. He says, we shall go on to the end. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength. We shall never surrender. One Royal Army Air Force squadron captain spoke for the nation. After those speeches, we wanted the Germans to come. As British historian Max Hastings later stated, Churchill's sublime achievement was to rouse the most ordinary people to extraordinary perceptions of their destiny. Here's a critical point for us. Hastings tells us we should never forget that there was a time when events now in the past were still in the future. Nobody knew how that war was going to end. Just as today, nobody knows what's going to happen in the Ukraine. Nobody knows except Putin, baby Putin. Nobody knows what's going to happen in China and Taiwan. Nobody knows what's going to happen to this world except us. Let me repeat that, and please let these words sink in. We should never forget that there was a time when events now in the past were still in the future. I didn't bring it, but I have a biography of Churchill's from 1941, and in it, it was written before the end of the war, and it talks about they hope it will end well because it's not been written. This is one of the great blessings we have as a spiritual assembly. We know for certain how this will end, what will happen, when the kingdom of God will come, but it's still in the future. But I submit to you, and that's the point of this sermonette, that won't always be the case. Our day, our hope will be fulfilled, and that is an unbreakable promise. I submit to you that we, like Paul and like Abraham, we believe and we worship a God who gives life to the dead and calls those things which do not exist as though they did, who, contrary to hope, in hope believed. That is our place. Regardless of COVID, of inflation, of Russia, of economic turmoil, of China, of polarized states of frenzy, of a time when we see problems and danger where we live, we can believe, and we should believe, because our God calls things which do not exist as though they did. It will happen. And we should do this all the more as we see the day approaching. As the historian wisely notes, we are in today and the future when certain events, the coming and kingdom of God, are in the future. This won't always be the case. And that's true for all of us. Here today, those of you in this range of the sound of my voice, all of us. So let's look at Hebrews 10:24 and 25 one more time. We read three things. We are to consider how to stir one another up to love and good works. These are things we are supposed to be doing right now. 2, we are not to neglect to meet together. It's hard to do that if you're not in person. And 3, we are to be encouraging one another all the more as we see the day approaching. That day, for some people, was last year or the year before. It may be for some people this year. But it doesn't matter. We are to do it as long as we draw breath today. It is important that we do these 3 tasks now. The Greek word for encouraging or exhorting is transliterated parakaleo, Strong's 3870 for you Strong fans. It means to summon, to call to one side, to speak in a manner that strengthens, comforts, and encourages. So I ask myself today, how many people have you come alongside today and spoke to or listened to in a manner that strengthens, comforts, and encourages? Like Aaron Dean and others in this room today, you remember from when we had the ABC piece, Jamie and I were physically there when many of these events he described on the Pasadena campus took place. And as you might have seen in some of the slides he presented, I actually wrote a lot of these stories. You can see a certain byline there. They were printed. So I saw this. Jamie and I saw this. We were both recently in Pasadena. Most of those physical things are gone. They don't exist, or they're a shadow. So what does that mean? Here's my belief, and I'll tell you this. The Bible emphatically declares that a great globe circling work will be done before the return of Jesus Christ. A lot's already been done. But I believe the great work, the work that everybody will remember, is yet to come. Like Churchill said in 1933, it may well be that the most glorious chapters of our lives, our history, are yet to be written. We are glad to be here at such a time, rejoicing at the responsibilities that have been given to each one of us. So yes, we're in tough times. People describe these times as destabilizing, as promoting uncertainty. But as we wrap up here, consider this. You can counter uncertainty, subversion, stability, instability by emphatic listening, by a kind word, listening like you really mean it, by showing kindness, by doing something pleasant that was unexpected, and by coming alongside and speaking in a manner that strengthens, comforts, and encourages. And we're supposed to do this while believing and worshiping a God who calls things which do not exist as though they did. And we're supposed to do it all the more. God has called each one of us to be a Churchill. We don't have to have his eloquence or flamboyance, but we can have singleness of purpose. We can believe and act on that belief even when we don't feel like believing. We can make deliberate, intentional choices to consider how to stir up one another to love and to good works, to meet together like we're doing now. Whether here in person or online, and by the many marvelous ways we can connect, cards, phone calls, texts. And we can choose to be encouraging to each other with our powerful words, coming alongside each other and speaking in a manner that strengthens, comforts, and encourages all the more.